This is the Off Air Podcast with Rachel Schneider, a show for all the things that don't make it on air. Honest, engaging, in-depth conversations highlighting people making a difference and making waves in their community. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for listening. I'm so excited to share this episode. It's a special one today. Today, I talked to the Capaul Twins, who host their own podcast. You may have already listened to it. It's called Let's Talk About Death. Benny and Nick Capaul grew up in a funeral home in Ida, Michigan. That is in Monroe County, where I'm from. And one of them went into the family business. Benny is a funeral professional like his father and that grandfather and his father before him. And his twin brother, Dr. Nick, is a psychologist. But they do much more than that. These are busy guys. In addition to their podcast, they also have another YouTube show called Capaul's Corner. They're in a band. They're both husbands and dads, and they grew up doing theater like me, which you can totally tell by the way they talk. They're so entertaining. As I mentioned, they're musicians, and the intro to their podcast shows that. It's amazing. As you can tell, I'm a fan of the show. I may have been one of the first listeners. They're both young and hilarious, which makes the topics that they cover all the more enjoyable to learn about. They're so fun to talk to, and they really break down why they started their podcast. Obviously, the show, Let's Talk About Death, that's what they talk about. And we covered so many different subtopics about death and stigmas around death, but mainly they just want to get the point across that it's okay to talk about death, and people should do it more. And more people have, unfortunately, had to, because of this awful, heartbreaking pandemic. Death has come to the forefront of many people's minds recently, and COVID-19 has taken a lot of people's loved ones. And this is a timely episode to do. Like I said, it's a special one, and I want to take the time to announce that this show is dedicated to Haley Langmeyer and her family. In the interview with Benny and Dr. Nick, I mentioned that I grew up with Haley. I performed in musical theater alongside her for the better part of probably 10 years. And Haley and I, regrettably, were not close one-on-one, but anyone who does theater or maybe played a sport with the same teammates throughout your childhood, you know that there's a bond there. I mean, when you grow up with these people, you grow up around people, you have special moments and memories with them. And at the RRCA, we were all a family. We are all a family. And the Langmeyer family especially was very involved at the theater. And my theater family in Monroe is still grieving right now. There was a beautiful memorial service for her held at the theater last week, which I watched online through YouTube since I couldn't be there in person because I moved recently. So I did reach out to Lori Langmeyer, Haley's mom, and ask if we could dedicate this episode to her. And she agreed, and I am so honored. So if you have been affected by this pandemic in any way, or maybe you're curious or you have questions about death, Benny and Nick's podcast, Let's Talk About Death, is an awesome resource, and I hope that I can highlight the great work that they're doing and the awesome conversations that they get to have around this topic. And they've got all of their information about where you can find them at the end of this episode. I've also included their social media handles and a link to their podcast in the description of this episode if you would like to find them later on. So as their slogan goes, if you're not talking about death, you're not living. So without further introduction, let's talk about death with Benny and Dr. Nick.
Why do you keep looking at my tie?
Well, I was making sure we color matched.
Well, I don't think are we color matching?
I don't know. It looks good. It's fine. It'll work.
I know. And you guys are just so fancy. And I'm a news reporter 5 days a week, and I have to be like full dressed up, makeup and everything. So for this stuff, I was like, oh my gosh, I don't have to do that. This is great. And then I see you come on here with like ties and button up shirt. I'm thinking,
well, we didn't know if you were gonna actually put the video up or if it was audio. We didn't know. So
I mean, I'm wearing jeans.
Yeah, we're in shorts. Let's just be real.
I got slippers with dad life on them, so we're doing pretty good.
I'm cracking it, man. That's real dad life. That's real dad life.
Heck yeah. We're in Zoom fashion, right? You just like business on the top, party on the bottom.
That's it.
And you're good.
Well, I'm chugging a beer behind the scenes, so hopefully that doesn't. Hey, listen, I'm gonna chug this beer, and then I'm ready to rock. If you're ready to rock.
Oh yeah, no, We're already rocking. This is great.
Oh gosh. Oh, this is going to be perfect.
So I'll just start. I'll give you guys a little, I was talking to Kelly about this, when I first reached out through your Instagram and then talked to her to set this up. But, I've been a news reporter the past 2 years. I'm from Michigan and got my start there and worked in Toledo, and then got another job because we work on 2-year contracts. And then I actually moved to Roanoke, Virginia. So I'm still in the broadcasting world, but I'm starting this podcast and I'm going to call it Off Air with Rachel Schneider, because when you do Schneider, yes,
Schneider
biter, like the pretzels, right? Isn't that Schneider?
Those are Schneider. It's a little different. So the SCH, you have to put like the extra German, like the sh.
The sh. Yeah. You gotta have phlegm in your mouth.
Yeah, absolutely. Like hawk it up. And then that's how you say my last name. Mm-hmm.
Beautiful.
Yeah. But when I do TV interviews, we don't get to do stuff like this. It's all very, very short, very, very quick. Like you don't really get into the fleshy stuff. No,
it's not intimate. No.
You don't get into the
We don't get to see the Queen shirt.
That's really what
Bohemian Rhapsody. You know what I mean? Like, let's rock.
Yeah. I know. No, this was in Detroit. It makes me so sad because I saw them at the Palace with Adam Lambert years ago. Mm-hmm. And the Palace is not a thing anymore.
No.
It's so crazy.
Did you see the pictures of the Palace? Like the inside now that's tore up and stuff. It's so weird.
It makes me so sad because that's like half my childhood memories, seeing Disney on Ice and stuff at the Palace, and now it's not a thing.
Well,
it was a nice stadium. It really was.
Yeah.
So many. We didn't we see Billy Joel there?
We might have.
We seen Billy Joel there like the year before. So it's crazy.
Yeah. No.
William.
Just like how much those things have changed around there. But that's the thing too, is moving to this new city in Roanoke, you get to see, like, I have all these people who have lived here their whole lives telling me, giving me directions saying, oh yeah, you go by this. It's by the old Wells Fargo building here. And this is by that old stadium. And I'm like,
yeah, that makes sense to me.
Yeah, right. No, totally.
Yeah, Wells Fargo.
Can you give me an address? And I'm going to put it in my phone anyway, but thank you for telling me to go southwest on that street past the old stadium, because that's so helpful.
When you see the pig down there at the corner, you're going to make a sweep left there.
You're going to have to do that old Ohio turn there then.
We got that southern slur going on here.
A little bit. It's not as much as I would have thought. Like everybody says this is the South. It really doesn't feel like the South.
No. Do they make fun of your accent?
All the time.
Yeah.
I've never.
What are the things? What do we say that for them that you notice that they bring up? Other than I hear we talk slow, which doesn't make any sense to me.
So
because I thought
it's not that we talk slow, but I've gotten multiple times that we accentuate our vowels too much. So like we drag out like the vowel sounds and things. Like I said water the other day, and somebody was like, "What did you say?" Because they said it like worder. I was like,
worder.
You're gonna get that wash in there, the water.
Go down there to that worder club.
Yeah,
you accentuated it though.
Well, I'm a little bit of both. My dad was born there, but my mom was born in the UP.
Oh, is that what it was?
So it's a little bit of both.
Your dad was born where?
It was, this is all part of the character. That's not really. My dad was born. Actually, my dad was born in Italy. True story.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he's an army brat. He was born on a base, in Italy. So it's really cool because he's got 2 birth certificates. He's an Italian citizen and an American, which is really kind of cool. But anywho,
yeah. And then your dad, aren't you like a second generation?
So I am actually a fourth generation. So my dad, his dad, and his dad, so my great grandfather started the business with his brother, and his brother died at a very young age. He got in a horrible car accident and died. True story for a funeral director. So his brother took over, and we've been in Ida, Michigan for 85 years plus now. So it was great. It was great grandpa, then dad, then me. So there's 4 of us, 4 generation funeral directors here in Ida, Michigan. So
yeah,
that it is.
So then I guess I have to ask then, is this like a my girl thing? Like, did you grow up in the funeral home?
Absolutely.
I'll even go further with the My Girl thing. First of all, I think if anybody, I'm close to Dan Aykroyd. I think that was
who
really
doesn't
cool.
like Dan Aykroyd.
So
Skull Vodka.
it's very
really
cool.
Fun.
My wife, who I married way before she met me, loved, that was her favorite movie, and she always wanted to name her daughter Veda if she ever had a daughter. So later in life, she married a funeral director, and our first daughter is named Veda. And my son is named Roman, which Dan Aykroyd plays in another movie, The Great Outdoors. So basically, my life is a Dan Aykroyd script.
Obviously. Oh my god.
But yeah, no, actually, true story. We brought up My Girl. I don't know if you heard that episode, but we brought it up because it was one of the only times that we thought a funeral director was well represented in a movie.
Really?
There's there's a scene where he's embalming with like another associate of his, and they're talking about that person because she was in the community. And when you see funeral directors in movies, they're always very stiff. They're very like, would you like the gold package for your mother?
And they have the creepy long arms and they've never cut their fingernails in their life,
So they're never really humanized. And so in that movie, like they're like, remember My Girl? She's like playing in the like the rooms, and grandma's rocking in the corner, and he's playing a tuba in the middle of the funeral home. Like that's like real. Like this is our life. We were born and raised next to a funeral home, but the funeral home is part of our home. When there was nothing going on, Nick and I would play Nerf guns down in the chapels and get in trouble and run around the casket room and get in trouble. This was our life. This is what so we've seen a lot of families, they would come and park, and Nick and I would be playing outside and have to run in because we were, messing up their visitation arrangement or whatnot. But we were always surrounded by death. And as we grew up, because we were lucky enough to be the sons of a funeral director who was also a son of a funeral director and a son of a funeral director, we were taught how to deal with death and what death is really truly about, and what the funeral profession actually does and why it's important. And so that's another reason why I think our podcast really stands out, because you're not only getting just what you're taught to think a funeral professional, you're actually getting the inside scoop of someone who is born, raised, and brothen, because I can't pronounce the O's for you, brothen, in the funeral and death profession. So I think that kind of does that cover your question?
Well, what's another fascinating thing I think we need to add here too is that Ben and I both went for opposite things when we started college. Ben actually went for psychology, and I actually went for funeral directing. And about 2 years in, we both decided to switch. I went the longest you possibly could. I just didn't like school. I was never a school guy, and I ended up getting a doctorate.
Yeah, that's very true. I actually wanted to be the psychologist. You wanted to be the funeral director. And I, at first, didn't like the 24/7 game, it's a very hard sell when you're working 365, 24/7.
Well, we had an at-home mom. Our mom took care of us. Bless her heart, 4 boys and 2 twin boys at the end. And we would see my mom have to deal with my dad having to go out on Christmas or Christmas Eve, and go pick up a body and stuff. And that really, shunted how we looked at marriage, right? Because we didn't want to ever put our wives in that predicament. So I think Ben went into school thinking, I'm going to go the psychology route because it's usually like a 9 to 5, which really it isn't, but it's the belief, right? But it's a lot less than what Ben has to deal with. And then we switched. We flip-flopped. I ended up going and getting my degree in clinical psychology and specializing in grief and loss, because one of the things that Ben and I also realized when we were growing up was the importance of aftercare. There's not a lot of aftercare out there for people that are grieving. Not saying that it doesn't exist. It does, but it's...
So what's aftercare?
So aftercare is, so Ben will talk about dealing with the family, right? The
Sure.
death happens,
right?
But the death, Ben will say this better than I can, but I'll try to do it as best as I can. The death happens. They have to come see the funeral director. They have to plan what's going on. They have to plan how the funeral is going to look, or the visitation, if they're going to have one. Direct cremation, are they going to have what's the cremation? Memorial service.
Mm-hmm.
And then all that stuff, right? So then the funeral's done. The memorial service is done. They're in the ground, or they're, the urn gets sent home with the family. Then what? Right? because that's the thing. Like for the first couple months, you have friends and family that are calling you every day and saying, hey, are you doing okay? There's a lot of casseroles being sent. There's a lot of cards being sent. There's a lot of phone calls, and then it stops. And then life in the United States, at least in our experience, is that you got to move on, like get over it, right? Because we're in a society that really wants people to move on. And the reality is that grief and loss, people will ask me all the time, like, how long am I going to grieve? And the reality is how long is that person going to be dead for? If that person is going to be dead for the rest of your life, then you're going to be grieving the rest of your life.
Yeah.
And that's the tough part, right? And again, funeral directors are put in a really rough position because they're dealing with families day in, day out that are actually going through death. Like we just lost grandma, we just lost mom, we just lost our daughter, we just lost that. They unfortunately don't have the time to call these families up 6 months later, a year later, 2 years later, 3 years later, 4 years later. So then what's in place for these people? Because then the problem becomes they come into my office and say, am I crazy? It's been 3 years and I'm still grieving for Jim. And it's like, no, you're not crazy. Grief
like you're
is
human.
not. Yeah, you're human, right? But that's not how society sees death,
right?
Society sees death. It is amazing. You can even ask Ben this. This is a reality. You have to sign a permission slip to go to a funeral for your job. That's ridiculous. Yes.
Really?
Yes.
Yeah. So going on to a little bit more of this aftercare. The aftercare is just basically what kind of care do we give families after the death occurs, right? In some families, and the big problem comes up, some families don't want any help. They don't want you to do that. They don't want to be a burden. They want to go through this themselves.
Right.
But the biggest problem is this. So there's a good plan for prior to death. You got hospice nurses, you got palliative care, you have death doulas on the rise, which I think is incredible if you haven't looked into that. But you have these things set up for these families to deal with, as they call it, the transition period from living to death, right? Then death occurs, we get the call, we go on the call, we pick up the loved one, and then we meet the family and kind of deal with the rest of the particulates later. We do if it's a traditional, you do the visitation, you do the funeral, you do the burial, or you do the cremation afterwards. But then, we're dealing with more cases, right? We're not just dealing with that case. So especially in a small town like Dad and I are dealing with, we're dealing with close to 100 families a year. So a traditional funeral usually takes about 3 to 5 days if you think about it. So if you add times 100 to 3 to 5 days, you're talking the whole year basically. So what happens is we have to keep going because we got to help the new family coming up to the death that occurs. So what happens is
you're never going to go out of business. I mean,
but there's also but a lot of people think funeral directors are scam artists and they're just taking advantage of people during the worst time in their life.
Can I take over right here?
Well, I just want to say, I can tell you from my personal experience from being a son of a funeral director that I know how much care and thought goes into what my father has done and his father has done. I'm not saying every funeral director is the same, just like every cop isn't the same or every doctor isn't the same. But I'm just saying that most funeral directors care. That's why they get into it. So go ahead, Dr. Nick.
So I wrote my dissertation on what is the experience of being a funeral director. So that's what I wrote. That's how I got my doctorate. And the one thing that I really want to emphasize. Wait, I'm trying not to do the
say it like a Midwesterner. Emphasize.
Emphasize. I gotta emphasize this. Is that, so you think about a wedding, right? You have a wedding planner. You pay a lot of money for this wedding planner, which is outrageous, but it's the reality, right?
Right.
And
for some people, that's good. And luck.
they have a year to set this up.
More, sometimes more.
Funeral directors have three days.
Oh my gosh. You're
you know what I mean?
Right. You're so right.
So this is the reality. When people, the biggest problem I have, what I've come to see is that we have lost value in what a funeral is, right? And how important it is because of how we want to just move on. We don't want to talk about death, but definitely we don't want to sit and suffer from it. Right?
Well, and Dr. Nick, I love how you've said in past episodes how funerals are not for the person who is passed, it's for the living. I never
Absolutely.
looked at it that way before, because I feel like you always think you're going to, Jeff's funeral. So it's for, you have to show your respect for that person, but you're saying it's for the people who are still here.
You're showing respect to the survivors, not only to Jeff, because Jeff lived a good life. He did a lot of great things. We're all memorizing him, right?
To Jeff.
To Jeff. Whoever Jeff
To
we're
Jeff.
talking
Jeff.
about. To Jeff. But the reality is that what I think people lose track of is that the people that are really needing people at that moment in time is the family and friends, the people that really cared about Jeff, because they have to go home and now reconstruct their life without Jeff.
That chair's empty. That bed's empty.
We talk
hallway's empty.
I talk about widows and widowers a lot, because the reality is there's a lot of they've been married for 50 years and then Jeff is dead.
Right.
And the reality is that widower or widow, depending male, female, the reality is that person's life is done, because what they planned on, to take care of Jeff, to love Jeff, to do all this stuff is now gone. Mm-hmm. So they have to reconstruct and make new meaning of their life. So to ask them to do that in 3 days is, excuse my French, but it's effing ridiculous.
It's bonkers.
Yeah. It's bonkers, right? But that's where we're at in society, is that you get maybe 3 days to grieve.
And like Dr. Nick was saying, and you have to get in a lot of jobs a permission slip to be there, right? You have to prove that you were at your own aunt, grandma's. There's a cat in the background of your shot.
I do. Yeah, that's her.
Hello, kitty cat.
That's Princess Jasmine.
Princess Jasmine.
Yeah.
Heck yeah, I was
Aladdin. An Aladdin fan. Yeah.
Heck yeah, rock and roll.
Yeah. Well,
she's 16 years old. I got her when I was in 3rd grade, and obviously was a big Aladdin fan at the time. So
who is it?
I mean,
who wasn't? Jafar, right?
Prince Ali. Honestly, it's sad, because if you think about it, it's so important. Like this is what we're saying. So what we're saying, Dr. Nick was saying, was little girls, right? They plan their weddings from the day they're born, right? They plan the dress they're going to wear, the ring that's going to happen, blah, blah, blah.
What their hair's going to look like.
Nobody plans their death, which, no offense, is guaranteed. It's not guaranteed you're going to have your wedding, but it's guaranteed you're going to die, right? That's true. It's the truth.
Boom.
And the truth hurts. And if that slipper fits, you got to wear it. You know what I mean? But, I didn't know if you knew, Dr. Nick and I are also professional matchmakers.
We are love makers. We don't even say matchmakers. We say love makers.
Love and makers.
I actually set his
I feel like
this is real
you
story.
set him up
with his wife. Yep.
And
you didn't do it for me.
Yes, I did.
No, you didn't.
Who knows? Who knows? Who cares?
Did you meet her, Dr. Nick? And she was like, you know what? My Girl is my favorite movie. And he was like, boy, do I have.
Actually, I had no idea that she liked My Girl. Actually, I had no idea about that.
Talking about my girl.
My girl.
Was that song in your wedding?
No. My wedding song was "The Luckiest" by Ben Folds. I think it's the greatest song I ever wrote. Mm-hmm. And then my second one was "I'll Catch You" by the Get Up Kids. So those were the two big kids. But anywho's, yeah. So death is it's always interesting, because what I find in my profession is it's the last thing you want to talk about, but it's so important if you do. Like the families that actually do talk to their kids about, this is what I want and how I want it, or they go into the funeral home and they actually set up a pre-need or whatnot, and they have everything set up. Those kids come in and they look at me, and you could just say relief on their face, because they don't have to make those decisions, right? They already know what mom and dad wanted. But for so many, they don't. Or, dad will say to one kid, I want to be cremated, and the other kid, I want to be buried. So where does this, now there's this internal struggle that they have to deal with, on top of they only have 3 days to do it. So basically, yeah, like Dr. Nick was saying, you have usually the death occurs, and within 3 to 5 days, you're having the funeral, right? That's boom, boom, bang.
Bing, bang, bang.
And then all of a sudden, the casket's in the ground, in the vault, and now I'm home, and everybody's gone, right? Everybody has to go back to their lives. That's the other thing too. We have to live. Not saying that our loved ones wouldn't want us to go back to our lives. Absolutely they do. But that's the problem, right? So people always ask me, what can I do for this family? And my answer to them is this: don't just call them or come up to them and say, call me if you need me, because they're never going to call you. They're never going to call.
Yeah.
What I suggest you do is go to them 6 months to a year down the line, when it's the next birthday, the next anniversary, Father's Day, Mother's Day. That's when you go and make a random stop in, because that's when people stop going, right? The cake, like Dr. Nick was saying, the cake stop, the cake.
Would you stop with the cake?
Casserole stop.
Nobody
coming,
brings cakes.
The presents, the phone calls, and then all of a sudden, because
Happy birthday, your dad. Like nobody brings cake. Nobody brings cake.
But here's the actual caveat of that comment. And the comment is this: when those stop coming, that's when a lot of people's grief first starts. Yeah. Because they've been distracted by other people. They've been distracted by the funeral. They were distracted by all the paperwork and the legal stuff, right? Getting the car changed over, the house changed over. Now, when everything's quiet, it's, now I'm under the realization that this is happening, right? Mm-hmm. So this, yet again, this podcast was started, and the reason why Dr. Nick and I try to educate, because the more we can educate on death, the less scary it becomes, the less bite death the Grim Reaper actually has, because we've already talked about this. We've confronted this, right? Mm-hmm. And especially, we also talk about like people who are going through, right? They just found out they have stage 4 cancer, right? And they don't want to talk to their loved ones about death, but their loved ones don't want to talk to them about death to bring up the reality of the situation, but everybody just really wants to talk about it, but they don't know how to. So if we start educating and it starts with our children, and that was another big push that I want to do, and we should start educating young kids in school on death education, right? We have sex education, but we don't have death education. We have
so what exactly would we tell them there in a death education class?
Like, death is going to happen, and we should celebrate the life of the person, right? We should honor them. We shouldn't be scared of it. We should be ready for it, right? Because if we can start fixing those problem-solving skills, because grief isn't just about the death, right? Grief is about death of a friendship, death of a job, death of an environment, death of a marriage, divorce, right? So if we can learn these coping skills on any grief, we can also apply them to other things. So it's not just specifically about, how do I deal when grandpa dies? Or how do I deal when all this happens? Because for some people, they're 19, 20 before they deal with
I also think education kids, it's about letting them know what to expect. You're going to see grandpa is going to be room temperature. So for you, that's going to feel cold, right? That's one thing that I always thought was beautiful that my dad has done for years, is pulls the kids aside and just explains to them the biology of what's going on.
Really? Like at funerals when the grandkids show up? I was sorry, I completely cut that off. But so can you talk about then, I guess you both can jump in on this, but with the funeral like that, when he has that conversation with kids, you said that's something he's always done, and the parents just kind of,
Yeah, so usually there's what they call a family hour. Usually when the family comes in, and they usually bring the grandkids and the great grandkids, right? So Dad and I will stop them after they do their initial view, right? The kids don't know what to do. They don't know how to feel. What we do is we ask permission. We say, do you mind if we talk to the children? And everybody's like, absolutely. Because let's be honest, most parents want to hear what we say because they don't know how to talk to their kids. So what we do, like Dr. Nick was saying, is we'll say certain things like, first of all, you can touch grandma or grandpa. Grandpa's going to feel room temperature. That's because we put in a medicine, right? Kids are concrete. You don't have to go into embalming, right? That would scare them. But if you go into, we put a medicine inside them, and that's to keep you from getting a cold, because that's the only thing at this point they can give you. Kids are very concrete. Another thing we say is there are feet in the casket, because if you don't, some kids really think, where did the feet go? No,
it's true. We laugh about this, but it's true.
Concrete. So another thing is we talk about the casket, right? Like a box. And we represent that by saying, on your birthday or Christmas, what do you usually get? And, make it a fun game where the kids are like, oh, we usually get presents. And what do the presents come in? Boxes. Grandpa's in a box because he is a present to us. These are certain things that their minds can understand, they can grasp. And then we tell them, again, most cemeteries require you to be in a vault. So we say put grandpa in another box at the grave to keep him protected. And then the fancier the box, usually fancier the gift. And then I bring up to any of the young girls, because we just talked about this, that they plan their weddings from day one. I say, someday, if you're truly lucky, the love of your life is going to get down on one knee And if they don't have that box, you say, and all the parents are laughing because they yell, they yell no, right? You don't you don't say yes to getting married unless there's that box with the ring. So it's like bringing this whole into bring death into a lightning, a good way to bring a positive spin on death. So another big thing that a family did years ago that Dad and I always tell families I don't know if you ever been to a funeral where they have those pillows in the casket, Rachel.
Yes.
They're like little, and they'll say grandpa or papa or whatever. One family took it home, and Dan and I were like, oh, can I ask why? Because most people will leave them in the casket. And this family said, yeah, we've been doing as a tradition now that the next time somebody gets married in the family, we use it as the ring pillow because it brings a positive spin on the death of grandma, and it brings grandma or grandpa to the foreground at this wedding. So yet again, that's something old, something blue, something, there's your something old, or there's
yeah.
So, but I thought that was so cool because that is what we need to do, right? We need to make because funerals are supposed to be a celebration. And I think that's what's getting lost, and it's needed. Some people don't need to see somebody in a casket. There are other people that do. They need to actually witness it. So there's a lot of times in direct situations, which I have no problem direct cremation. If that's what your family wants or burial, that's what you need to do. But what happens is you get a grandkid that calls and says, is there any way I can see grandma? And then by that time it's already done.
Right. Yeah.
And that person is, you can just tell, is devastated. And then sadly, we'll be going to see somebody like Dr. Nick because they never had that opportunity to say goodbye, I'm sorry, et cetera, et cetera.
So that brings us, Dr. Nick.
One last thing I want to throw in there. One thing also that's important for parents or anybody to know about kids is that kids grieve in their own ways. They're not, depending on their age, their brain is still developing. So right away, they may not have questions, but a year later, they might ask you, like, where's grandpa? Like you said, grandpa, never tell kids that grandpa is sleeping. That is not a good thing because then they think every time they fall asleep, they're going to die. So do not tell people that someone that died is sleeping, because there is some kids that really literally take that to heart and think that every time they fall asleep, they might die. So please, if I can get anybody to listen to this, do not tell kids that.
Big PSA there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And kids, like we were saying, kids are very concrete. If I have a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old, and if they really want to know something, they're going to ask. And my honest opinion is just be honest with them. You don't have to, like I said, you don't have to go into it. Another one is cremation, right? A lot of kids ask, they knew grandpa, grandpa threw him up on his lap. He played with them. And then now they go to the house and he's in an urn, right? Well, to them, that doesn't make any sense. How did grandpa get into an urn, right? There's a big size difference, right? So what my dad said, and I thought it was beautiful, was bring up yet again a positive outlook. Do you remember when's the last time you went to a campfire? And they're like, oh, just recently. And we said, how do you set up a campfire? And they say, oh, you bring twigs and sticks and you make them really big, right? It's huge. Actually, you have a good fire. What happens to those twigs when you burn them? And they're like, oh, it becomes ashes. And that's what we described. That's what happened to grandpa. And then their minds can figure that out.
Right, but you put the spin on it. The positive spin.
It's a positive.
Was a campfire.
It was a campfire. We're having a good time.
Fun. You're with family and friends, and it's so you bring it in that way.
My Lord,
absolutely.
Kumbaya. Boom, boom.
Yeah. No, obviously I did not have that experience growing up in a funeral home. So these are just things that me as a layperson, I don't think about, have never talked about before. And that made it all the more interesting with your podcast, especially with so many people, I think, experiencing death this year, with the pandemic. And then one of you had said before, like, some people don't need to see their family member, their loved one in a casket, but others do. In a situation like we've had this past year where many people maybe didn't get to see their loved one.
Yeah.
There's going to be a huge mental help need here in the next couple of years, because so many of us, and rightfully so, did not get the opportunity to experience the funeral any way that we were used to or needed to at the time. And it's a pandemic. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. There, for a while we were under strict rules where you can only have 10 in the funeral home. You had to be socially distanced. Then it was 25, then it was 50, but at the same time, there was a lot of families that only could have 10, or there was a lot of private funerals at graveside or in the funeral home themselves. And that's tough too, because if you were number 11, I apologize out there. Sorry, Frank.
Just didn't make the list.
You're on the B squad. You were number 11, but
we have to use humor in a situation like this, because the reality is it sucks. There's no win here. There's no win for the funeral director. There's no win for the families. There's no win for anybody. And the reality is that this hopefully will bring, again, the idea of value back to the funeral, which I think has been lost. And I think that's the reason why a lot of people think funeral directors are crooks, is because they have lost value in the whole process of grieving, and the whole process of a funeral and how important it is. So hopefully Ben and I can educate people on the importance of that.
Yeah, no, I think you have. I mean, I've barely had to ask a question here, and I feel like we've covered so many different things and stigmas that people may already have around death. And as far as people dealing with it, like I said, just in the past year or two, I had a friend from childhood. She was only 22 years old. She recently passed last week from COVID-19. And
I'm so sorry to hear that.
Yeah, well, thank you. But it's been so weird to see that come into my life, because when you're in your 20s, you don't think about your peers dying suddenly or from disease, or it just like, I feel like you're almost in this happy mindset where it's like, oh, people don't die until they're old, and that just like doesn't happen. But then of course, as a reporter too, I go to a lot of car accidents and, shootings, other things, unexpected things that happen. But at the same time, I mean, Dr. Nick, do you have any advice, without like giving away a free appointment, about like what people can do if they're experiencing a death of like a peer or somebody young? Because I think a lot of people may be in that boat this year.
So if you don't mind me asking, we don't have to go into deep things, but what was this friend's first name?
Her name was Haley.
I'm so sorry for your loss. And, to Haley's family out there who knows who we're talking about, I'm so sorry for your loss. I think the reality is that, as Ben and I have kind of talked about, the Grim Reaper is around. He's never not around. We don't know when we're going to die, right? Death anxiety is real. It happens. We don't know when our time is going to be called, and that is terrifying. So let's normalize that experience right now. Not to mention, we're dealing with a pandemic that is killing young people. Although some people out there don't believe it exists, please, if you don't think it exists, go talk to a nurse, because they will tell you that it is real and that we are losing young people. Now, with the flip side of that, how do you cope with someone like that? How do we deal with that? First of all, no parent should ever see their child die. I'm going to guess her parents are still alive. I'm guessing This is a woman. I'm sorry. Let me focus on that.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. No parent should ever have to deal with that. And to lose a child is, from my experience dealing with people, it's a life.
When a parent loses a child, it's ingrained in us as Dr. Nick and I are both parents, so we can say this. It's ingrained in us that we are their protectors. So our job is to protect them physically, mentally. So when we lose a child, we feel like we lost. We feel like we have not been a good parent, whether we know or not. Like cancer, you can't help cancer. You can't help a pandemic from happening. But it doesn't matter. As a parent, we're ingrained to think that we are in charge of them. And so when we lose a child, we lose part of ourselves, because whether we know it or not, right, it's a subconscious thing that we failed as a parent. So
let's go deeper with this. When any time a death occurs, there is always grief. And with grief, there is shame and guilt. We always feel like we should have. Let's talk about suicide, right? That's the topic that nobody really talks about. And that is actually skyrocketing right now during the pandemic, because these people are already isolated, and now we're telling them they have to stay home. So what do you think is going to happen? Let's be real here. And the reality is that with guilt and shame, we got to confront that, because we had no control over this pandemic. We had no control over. It's easy to say, hindsight is 2020, right? It's easy to say, if we would have known, we would have never let our daughter leave the house. We would have never let, with this pandemic or with suicide, I would have never left that gun there, But the reality is we do our best with what we know at the time. But we never give ourselves credit for that. We always judge ourselves in that we should have known. We should have known that this sickness was going to take her. So I should have. I always say this: stop shooting on yourself, right? Because that's the reality. It's so easy to try to go back in time and think of all the things that we did wrong. What I tried to tell Mom did right, because if you can go to there. The reality is that person who passed away probably doesn't want to see you angry or sad. They don't want to see you judging yourself, right? If they were alive today and you were sitting there going, oh, I should have done this, I should have done this, I should have done this, what do you think they're going to say back to you? Like, no, you're fine. Like, it happened. It's done with. Move on, right? We always have a hard time, especially with ourselves, judging ourselves. Sorry.
Right.
But the reality is that that's what we do as humans. We judge ourselves. So stop. Stop shooting all over yourself.
Oh, man.
No,
I think
those are great points. Yeah.
I think you've said reality like a bazillion times today.
But that is the reality of the reality.
That is your that's like your catchphrase apparently today. First and foremost, just like Dr. Nick, I'm sorry for your loss, and I'm sorry for every parent, brother, sister, child that lost their parents or etc. to this horrible pandemic.
But we're not disregarding your experience. We're sorry for your grief too.
Yeah, absolutely, Rachel.
Yeah. Oh,
absolutely.
Well, thank you. Thanks. Yeah.
But I another thing too is sometimes the best thing to do is not say anything. The best thing to do is be there and listen. Say, I don't know how you're feeling. I don't know why this is happening, but I'm here. And how was this experience with you? Like, how are you dealing with this experience? For most people, that's amazing, because everybody else is, I'm sorry for your loss. They're in heaven. Everything, they're not in pain anymore. Et cetera,
we want to separate ourselves from the reality that person died. And the one thing that Ben and I are desperately trying to do is, let's not shun away from death. It is what it is. It's a part of life, and we have to be okay with it. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying that this is Ben and I have a lifetime around death. So we have a different experience. Don't get me wrong. But the reality is that we need to talk about this. It needs to be addressed. We don't need to hide from it. The more and more we hide from it, the harder it's going to be to grieve. That's the reality.
Well, and growing up with this stuff, have you seen any generational differences in how people deal with death versus, I don't know if your father can
wait, I'm gonna pause you for a second. I'm gonna pause you for a second because we missed what you started off saying.
Okay. Sorry. I was asking, because you've grown up with this and it's been in your family for so long at the funeral home. Are there any like generational differences in how we've dealt with death now that we have so much updated technology at all? Or is this death has always been around, but with the environment changing, the future and everything, do people still kind of have these same issues and dealing with it because they still don't talk about it? Or what changes have you seen?
So the big changes I've seen in the funeral profession from even my dad's generation to my generation is, excuse me, Dr. Nick.
I swear I put that on silent.
The biggest thing I've noticed is people are straying away from the traditional church, right?
Okay.
When I was a kid, and even when I was a little bit younger, you every funeral was almost the same, right? You'd have 1 day in the visitation to 2 days in the funeral home visitation, and you would take the individual to their church, whether that was a Catholic church, Protestant church, Lutheran, whatever church they were comfortable with. Then you had the funeral and you did the burial. It was very traditional. It was people spent their lives in the church, right? Sunday you went to church. That's what you did. most of the businesses were closed. You went to church. That's what you did. So one of the big things that our generation, and even our parents' generation a little bit have changed is we don't go to church. So if they don't have a church or they don't have a pastor that they normally go to, it's more of a spiritual funeral than it is a faith-driven funeral. Does that mean? So a lot of the new things that are happening in the funeral service or profession are because of we're going from a faith church-driven funeral to now a spiritual. Right now, anybody yet again, this is not a wrong, right thing. I'm just telling you the truth of the matter. Anybody or anybody can become a minister now, right? So you can have a Star Trek funeral, or you can have no pastor or no pastor or cleric at all coming up and doing a rock and roll guitar solo for the end, or however you want to memorialize this person, right? It's more about the person now than it is about the faith they belong to. Does that make sense?
Okay, I'm going to go deeper.
Does. Yeah.
I'm going to go deeper with you. So here's the changes, right? First of all, we've become, we started out as a community-based to an individualized base, meaning that back in the day, back in the old hee-hay,
he's all.
Back in the hee-hay,
back in the the Detroit, it's cold in the D.
Back in the day, we used to have if our grandparents got sick, they would die at home, and you would have the service at home. So kids were involved in the funeral.
So that's really back in the day, but
I'm saying, that's the reality, right? I mean, let's talk about how generations this has changed.
Yeah.
Now it's like when someone dies, it's like, okay, get them as quickly out of wherever when they're dying, right? I hate saying this, but the reality is we're shipping all these old people off to retirement homes
or
nursing homes or hospice homes, right?
Right.
And the reality is that we're not seeing death like we used to. So our experience around death is even more pushed away. Not to mention that we've changed from a religious-based society to a spiritually based society. I think that a lot of us have spirituality, but a lot of us would agree we're not religious, right? I think those two mixed in together has made this really weird. I don't even know. I don't mean to say weird because it's not weird. It's just, it's different. This different way of visualizing what death should be. And I think it's so important to make a funeral individualized for the family that's suffering. Don't get me wrong. Absolutely. But there's so many other people besides the family that are affected by this person's death. And I think that gets lost. This is, he worked at Ford for 50 years. You can't tell me that there's not at least 15 to 20 people that are grieving his death. Like, oh my gosh, Jim, I used to see him every day for 12 hours a day, but yet they may or may not find out that the funeral is happening. So again, it's tricky because in this very separated society, because we're Zooming right now.
Yeah.
When we used to be sitting across the table from each other, screaming at each other, spitting on each other.
Mostly spitting.
Right. I mean, if you're ever around theater people, right, they will say if you sit in the first row, you're going to get the spit, right? When they're singing and musicals and they're projecting, they're spitting, right?
I was a theater kid, let me tell you, like the River Raisin Center in Monroe.
Heck yeah.
We did plenty of musicals.
Rocky Horror Picture Show for a really long time.
Me too. Yeah. So had a blast. But can I tell you, it's like almost heartwarming that you brought that up and mentioned that, because the reason that I met Haley was through theater, and they actually held her memorial service at the River Raisin Center.
That's awesome. That's
last
incredible.
Weekend.
So you must have been a couple years after Ben and I.
Did you were you in Rocky?
I was in it. Yeah. So I'm trying to think of the year it was, because I know they didn't do it for a couple of years because they wanted to try some other shows. And then when they brought it back, my voice teacher and director of many of the shows I was in, Tracy Glover.
Yep.
She was like, you have to be in Rocky. You've never been in Rocky before. I want you to be in this show. I was like, okay. And so I did it, and it was so fun. And then they didn't do it the next year again. I think it was, you know, a lot of the times it has to do with ticket sales and what shows are selling there.
Oh, absolutely.
But it was a blast.
We were in the original.
We were in the original. In fact, our brother Chris and his wife Alora at the time were the ones that originated the Rocky Horror,
bringing Rocky Horror Picture Show to the Rocky.
So, anyways,
the River Raisin.
So fellow thespians here.
I know.
But anyways, so death is just and now more than ever we need to talk about death, because like we were saying, with the pandemic and things opening up now, we really need, I think if anything we've learned is we really need to talk about death, because we don't talk about it enough. And hopefully our podcast gets out to, like Dr. Nick and I were saying, if we could help one or two people get through grief, we're doing what we signed up to do. So,
and anybody listening to this, like, just realize there's help out there. There is things that people you can reach out to about grief and loss who actually are weird, like Benny and I, who actually want to talk about this with you. So please reach out to your local funeral director. They love to sit with people and talk about this stuff. I mean, that's what they do for a living. Talk to your grief and loss specialist, psychologist, because this is what we do.
So where can people find you guys, and how can they get involved and contact you guys too, if they maybe have questions for the show?
So awesomely, we have so many avenues you can go to, but for the podcast, it's Let's Talk About Death. And you can find us at literally www.letstalkaboutdeathpodcast.com. We also answer real questions from you, the listeners, on our podcast, and you can email us and our Gmail at letstalkaboutdeathpod@gmail.com. So if you have any questions out there or thoughts, even about this, like, I didn't like what you said there, or, I really thought of the anxiety Dr. Nick mentioned, like, feel free to leave us some a question, but you can literally listen to us on anything, Spotify, Apple Music. If you do Apple Podcasts, please leave us a review, comments, questions,
5
all
stars.
those good stuff. We have an Instagram, Facebook, all of that. And honestly, we've really come, we're on this show. This is awesome. Like, this is incredible. So a fellow Monroean, Money Row.
We will rock you.
Boom. I would just Queen all
That's right. All right. Well, thank you guys so much. It was so much fun talking to you guys. And I knew it would be, just from listening to your show. And again, talking with Kelly, I'm so glad we could set this up, but, thank you so much. And I look forward to listening to more shows with you guys in the future. And maybe even if you guys get your own TV show too.
Yeah, who knows? Right? Who knows? Well, Rachel, if you're ever down for Christmas night, let us know. We know of a parking spot.
We got a good spot. We got a spot for you. Let's put it that way.
All right. I'll hit you guys up for that. Thank you guys. You have a great day. I'll see
Absolutely.
Bye. Thank you so much for listening. This has been an episode of the Off Air Podcast with Rachel Schneider, a show for all of the things that don't make it on air. If you happen to have any suggestions of who I should talk to next, if you know somebody who is really interesting and they are making a difference or making waves in their community, I would love to get to know them. Let me know how I can get in touch with them. If it's you, let me know.